Good morning, everybody. Day two of 14:39. Just some preliminaries to start with. Practices. Right. Rapid conference. Tough. Steps. Fine. So we will issue information. Then to extend the help by extend to try different diaries together. That's uh,
It's the main part of our evidence is related to how the methodology has failed.
convinced that you're where your comfort level is with what is comfort. Any suggestions you've got as to how to rectify?
Visually. So,
I mean, possible speaking. Trust. That's, and I'm particularly interested in you draw a lot of way. That
signing. In relation to the specific history of the locality, the area, the region, the nation.
and you say that that's not able, not under the kind of.
It has not been.
That's not been. I mean, we're looking
Yeah,
right there.
there is, in our evidence, we discussed that the values have been merged with geographical location. We feel that should be that's the values.
I would know. So just go to you've got a matrix in 710. Are you proposing that this is demonstration on some matrix? Assumption that for some criteria.
One of our concerns is that there is potential for a single operator to moderate degree of and but to go back to the architecture, many of those
but that is focused on the issue of the minimum threshold. Whether it be an A or a B.
so it's happening in there's two tables. The first table is looking at the cumulative value of the sub-criteria and how they challenge. So we're still talking about qualitative assessment in the foundation of methodology. This is once you have you're able to put the conclusions.
Sorry, so we were looking at the one of the figure 2, which is not some criteria.
Yes.
Sorry, which brief you got? Well, I'll have to get it up for you. That's what you're about to suggest. Yep. 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 So we'll do a total formula slow. Right. conversation about this, we're all saying, well, they're all saying the same thing, basically. And hopefully I can end it. And that's where I might stand, considering that.
So it's a binary question at that initial stage of this doesn't feel good or not. That's one of the criteria in any second stage. Or that or as you said, sort of thing. But I guess if we're conceptualizing what is the threshold is initially, well, it's that criteria.
I'm how they you're saying that when you apply the criteria, you have this answer. Step. some. That's yeah, absolutely. Thoughts? Still a question.
Process for having a great vision of and we should start what we in terms of constructing a lot of the people of work in relation to that one.
Coming back into a new question here, rules to have that thing to me that clarity around why they might be considered to unbelievable helps to distinguish what is particularly about this. That's where it's likely to start. Certainly, that's the right schedule. It got took us a long way to get this. But behind that, there's the sheet that relates to and that's the information that's recorded. It is to why so those things on this to what needs to be restricted.
It's a starting point, but I think as values change over time and as properties change over time, it could be something that was scheduled 12 years ago in another 12 years time because the values have evolved with higher
So something was going to answer a question whether or not the fact that any sort of rain days in the current ODP should not be there.
I'd love to be able to answer that question. But we haven't reviewed yeah, I think our evidence does speak to the proportions of category A to category B, and I think in the sample that's been used for plan change 9, we've got out of 180 odd only 4 are proposed to category A, bearing in mind that the proposals for plan change 9 represent 1.5 times the population of the current schedule. We're going to see a little bit more representation of category A proposals.
But isn't, I mean, I don't want to discussion of education and grading. Does it matter? I mean, should there be a quantum of that as well?
Well, I think it
as it comes.
calls the methodology into question that it hasn't produced.
Why?
The same.
Why does it call it into question? I mean, maybe that's all the A's are.
Maybe that's all there are. But I mean, I think that requires further investigation, interrogation. To actually think about the news comparables. To a certain extent, yes. I think we understand that the schedule hasn't been reviewed, so can change. But understanding that the particular the change in time assessment criteria is evolved from the schedule. You'd expect that the forecast of the aid is in the with such a large size.
All right, three, you talked about the application and the average. Now, are you suggesting that when, say, meet the sub-criteria, if all of the sub-criteria that achieve would it elevate to higher?
Potentially, so, okay. On the. Good. That's actually good. Yeah. It's the same. That's an illustration. I too.
I really found
It's just good. Criteria. It's become from a planning point of view, it's quite sometimes
LED, something, wasn't AI. Where do you take step back from? Make planning section being it's on really thorough consideration. It's on some section.
Differing degrees of influence from people that places out. And so, for example, we've obviously got the details of background and communication before. But there'll be other signatures that oppose that we don't have that information. Are you pushing us to, when we're looking at the contribution registered or not, if we're not satisfied that all of the information or that there could be something out there that we don't know about? Does it not make us? I mean, are you saying we should take a precautionary approach, or is it just where we've got
that information to come before us, which means that possibly it shouldn't make the list, then we just accept that. I'm just not clear what you're saying.
Well, it's the section 32, you've got to weigh up the risk. And so there's an element of subjectivity within that section 32 considerations. What's the risk of acting here? When there's all the other section 32 bits about, do we know that economic and cultural and social and so on costs the risk? There's an element of judgment there. But that will be informed by how much information you've got. And look, the reality is probably if you're out there and it's a house in suburbia, it's an outstanding example of something. Rounded up all the information, publicly available information and so on. You've got to make a judgment about risk. But I do think as well, it shouldn't necessarily be on the submitters. This is a council plan change. And the section 32 that needs to be on a scale and the depth of investigation that informs what's quite important provisions in the plan, business costs and so on. Sorry, I forget which of the last question about the WRPS criteria and how much are you bound by it. My planning answer to that is the methodology in the district. Well, the district plan is the big bet. So, given that there's acceptance that the operative plan methodology would be particularly as it's there, it's been tested. The methodology used in PC9 was massaged a bit and altered a bit. I think my answer is you need to be very wary or careful that you're satisfied that the methodology does actually give effect to the WRPS criteria. Otherwise, fundamentally, it's a problem. And don't ask me whether I know whether or isn't. I turn my mind to that. Other than that, there is definitely a guardrail into WRPS.
I mean, I think it's quite helpful your observation of the natural factors, plan decisions made, subsequent to the expert recommendation. Because I think the conversation has tended to the side of the fact that at the end of the day, it's schedule decision. The planner's decision question, but there is a decision.
I draw an analogy a decade or so ago. I managed to repay a district plan review, and we were grappling with how we felt different things. And you could argue that most of the European districts say that we need some level of outstandingness. And so there was the usual sort of and just about everywhere had elevated values. So just about everywhere we end up in the plan, no. We step back and say, okay, well, let's look at what's actually outstanding, what's actually significant when you look at section 2 and other things, and things are rationalised. But the point is, there's just that step back and there's an overall judgment made. And as I say, most of the time it may not make a difference, but I think it needs to be done. And especially, I think, sorry, going back to your question about what am I saying about risk? I think there's, especially when there's public sector buildings involved, it's a little bit of a different. There may be a bit more background there, a bit more relevant stuff than a house in the suburbs that's subdivided and been held in a very hot title since 1920. There could be other, especially in the public sector. I think there may well be other considerations come into it, but
So I'm just thinking about how I to apply. So I can divide it into two things. One is the criteria identification framework and assessment, and then is the provisions plan effect. Different. Second of those, I the normal sort of section 32 type so wait words. But the first of those, which is the creation of the list, are you effectively saying if the application is agreed criteria under the term produced 1,000 rules
No, I don't see. No. So what I'm talking about, there may be a doubt that whatever criteria maybe 1,000. One thing it needs to be are there other measures that within that county, some of them might count to the overall factors, not to shit. Others, divided on section 2.
Please.
Other things.
But any views on or
I'll start. I think that yes, there are cases or instances where a planner, if the plan is clear, could make that assessment in much the same way as a planner doesn't always rely on a traffic expert or doesn't always rely on a noise expert or any other experts. It'll be informed by the planner's relative experience and so on as well, of course, but guided as long as the plan is clear. I think there is a role, not all, but there would certainly be a back. See something. Where it was a bit grey or a bit tricky. Give us in that. The issue about hang on,
Would have been undermined. Well, whatever you've got, we'll take it. So, and I think it's right.
think the opportunity to be here today and my comments are. So, I'd like to, there's two documents. One is share another document. I do want to express my support for myself. I do want to share with you. I come today not as a technician. So there's three things I would like to talk about. One is the impact of this. When I read the documents, government policy, I would say, have been in place because of sorts of there are some it may require change. I'm interested in how entities have substrate there years ago. Does it change? Does it? Next point that I would like to raise with you is on the document David at this point. There's a number of discussions about including the incentives, rebates, and it goes on and says that to landowners quickly build heritage items to serve the sake of the community. However, all these methods create a financial burden for ratepayers that are outside the law. I think it's really noble. Ratepayers, however, I don't feel the assessment takes the hearing the Q1, Q2, the number of ratepayers in Hamilton. Two, the allocated fund for heritage value. That means the burden for ratepayers. Currently, council is producing. That's a contacted asked about X. So research the data. The average distribution. Obviously,
lifetimes. But it highlights there is a difference 5 times in speaking stuff. Now, comment on the seed that will increase times funds availability currently being and are likely going to be. So this report states that details. Others also. Final point I wish to make. It's like for the past 2 years, we've been talking love about Hamilton. Well-being. Under council's health strategy. United Nations Human Rights to get the seven. That is not that issue, but it's not a good thing. Yes, financial. I know too that when we speak about this, they were aware of this change. No, do want to see the I don't know the answer to this. Question. Some individuals are very. There'll be others that really. Every lady with the opportunity to be well-being and financial status. I just think it's quite fun. No, it's challenging. Ask me how can they make it? So that's not one. They did. Don't want to put a burden on my parents. So we don't want to put a burden on my parents. Bottom. It's not really good. So, yeah. Once it out, we don't mind they pay to make this a joke. It's so many I don't think it's might be. Doesn't say if it's not still in the store. Currently, don't want to do it. Currently, they Ouchies.
Heritage.
significant. All right. So. Yes.
The member there is completely independent.
Alan, welcome. Brown, welcome. Can you hear me? As well as you can, yes.
I think the sound is not working on the people are asking now.
Oh, really?
That's, yeah.
Right. Well, you only got a sign language?
I just hope that the watch is a good delivery. I'm here for Kind Aura. Mr. Brown is here for Kind Aura. We are going to, with your leave, just run through both aspects of the matters of concern to Kind Aura, which relate to both the built heritage items and historic heritage items. And I appreciate that you've split the hearing into a number of components, and Mr. Muldowney has given you only the built heritage part of his submissions, but I think in his discussion with you, he's covered in quite some detail the sorts of issues that we are concerned about in any event with respect to historic heritage areas.
We've got time, so.
Yeah, and it's also convenient for us as we come down. So thank you for that. Now, the second question, or the question I've got for you, is have you had a chance to read through the submissions? Would you like me to take you through them? Would you like me to speak to them? What degree of preparation do you have?
We've read them. We've all read them. We've all read them, so I'd like to speak to them.
What I might do then is cover some points that Mr. Muldowney raised yesterday, because I think they're probably going to be top of mind for you and for us. And there's a lot about which we agree. The issue really comes down to, I think, three things. Methodology with respect to the built heritage items. And on that, in summary, I think everybody agrees it needs some work. And that, as I understand it, is the reason why the experts are going to meet and try and work through that. Secondly, the threshold for scheduling in terms of those built heritage items. And Ms. Callaghan has raised concerns and issues about the use of the moderate term. And we share those concerns and probably go beyond them in terms of the things that we are concerned might arise as a consequence of the use of that term. We agree that some other term is going to be better. And the third issue then is the use of that moderate term in the context of historic heritage areas. And I suppose the last paragraph of my submission really dealt with the need or the desirability, I think, of using a similar term or trigger for both categories. And at the moment, we do not have that. We think we should.
And just to give you some comfort, we're minded that the two need to align very, very close.
So, is that a little bit of feedback? The first point I'll speak to was the discussion that you had with Mr. Muldowney regarding interim decision versus a partial decision, if I can call it that, versus an interim guideline. From our perspective, it's not critical which one you use. I accept that if you issue an interim decision, that's appealable. And the minute it's appealable, and it's on methodology, there's a fairly good risk of it being appealed. So that I think makes that a difficult route to take, because the methodology then informs the decisions you make. I think it might be useful to issue a summary at the end of this, giving your initial views, or in the same way that the Royal Military Plan panel gave its interim guidance on the AUP process, that tells people this is where our thinking is at. It's not a decision. You might like to bear it in mind. If you agree with it, you don't need to wade into great detail. If you don't agree with it, you might need to tell us when you're coming back to talk about the more detailed reasons why detailed matters why you think there's an issue. That would have the benefit of giving some clarity parties who are coming along about the framework of the discussion, but it avoids that risk of appeal being taken.
I guess the problem with that is that if the intent is to direct the assessment for the next round of hearings on particulars, that's still going to give the ability of those with disabilities to actually sit at differently. So we think that's getting
But it might be that some people are prepared to then say, look, we'll assess it in terms of your framework and we'll assess it in terms of ours, and the differences are what cases it will be clear you get a tick under both schemes, and in some cases it might be a tick under one. And so third option, of course, is to not issue, do nothing to just run until the next part of the hearing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. That is the normal way we do things. And the reason for issuing something is to try and clarify that is, if you've reached a point where you do it. The second point raised by Mr. Muldowney that I want to speak about is section 6F. And he makes the point that the definition, and we make it in our submission, doesn't contain qualifiers. It is a very broadly expressed definition, and as you pointed out yesterday, sir, if you just take it literally, pretty much everything qualifies. And in the case of the council's analysis of areas, for example, we go from 1860 through to 1980, there's no breaks in. Anything between those two dates is a tick of some sort. You can look at any street and say that educates me about the history of New Zealand. Because the street has got consistency, it can be because it has cottages, villas, bungalows, post-war, and 60s architecture or whatever. So the definition in its raw form doesn't get us. Mr. Muldowney, having made the correct statement about what the definition doesn't do, then acknowledged, as we do, that witnesses do have to be able to rank things. We do have to ascribe value to these things. And we've tried through the submissions to explain in the context of section 6F, the sorts of things we're looking at is dealing with in 6F with inappropriate subdivision development. And to make a judgment as to whether something is inappropriate, you need to have an understanding of the quality of the thing they're dealing with and whether there's an adverse effect that flows from. So in our submission, we do need a threshold. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. We have a disagreement about what the threshold might be. And again, I agree with Mr. Muldowney. It would be nice to have national direction as far as things, perhaps sometimes in place of national direction to tell us how we're going to live in our residential areas in quite such detail. We've got to a point where we have a lot of national direction, but sometimes the bits we benefit from are not. But that's okay, we'll post it. But look at this text. Coming then to that threshold and the issue we have in terms of moderate. The first point I'd make is that moderate is a very low bar. And everybody's language typically is high or significant or outstanding. And those sorts of categories, we understand it's something that's a little bit special. And we've had discussion about the best of the best or whatever, but we are in terms of A category heritage, that may be what we have. In terms of B category heritage, it's a bit broader, but it definitely needs to be something that's special, because otherwise we're effectively preserving our cities as they are. And we know we have a tension. Well, bodies that tension. But we do need a threshold, and in my submission, that term moderate just means it has to make a contribution, but it doesn't have to be a contribution that's at all going to attract somebody's attention or be something that we consider is particularly worthwhile. And the second problem is that once we use the word moderate, if we are the people who are ascribing meaning to it in terms of our system, that's one thing. If I think something's moderate and it qualifies, and I may in my mind be thinking that means it's significant locally or significant architecturally, that's one thing. But the word is then loosed on the community, and the concept becomes something that others deal with. And the view on what moderate means can be very low for other people. And have a real lack of certainty that I think words like high or outstanding, very high, avoid, because there is at that point a sense that this is better than most. It's looking at the top level as opposed to moderate, which could mean average, which could mean. So I think the fact that that term is both a low bar and a loose bar produces a real problem going forward. Mr. Muldowney referred to the definition as being binary, you either contribute or you don't, and that I think is part of the problem we're all grappling with. He talks about the conflation of terms and descriptions, and of course the benefit of some guidance, but also the benefit, I think, of it being broken down and rebuilt with the term. The difficulty is who's going to do that? And if it's through the process we're going through, then I think we need enough precision for the bottom of the category to enable people to look at something and say, that feels right. If we get to the point where there's too much that's included, we get to the position of crying wolf. And at that point, you have the risk, and I think one of the community groups that's interested in preserving heritage has said one of the issues is we've got an approach to the heritage areas that is really based on character, and the risk then is because that isn't as clean cut and as obvious as it should be, we may lose out on buildings and areas that should be covered. Long-term investment.
Well, on that point, because Mr. Edwards was talking about Section 32 and maybe on the more general judgment. Do you see it as a more general judgment, or do you see it as being the way that the criteria and methodology are written and interpreted, that actually the same thing? And is it, in the end of the day, does it come back to a rational process? Because I sense that if you wrote a criteria that gave you too high a number, say for Hamilton, 1,000, which is too high. But on what basis are you saying it's too high? What's an objective criteria? Right. You're driving it down because you're saying, no, we can't.
And I don't think it's a mathematical exercise, because there are places in New Zealand or Nauru where you have a high proportion of buildings that are built by pictures, places in New Zealand, and less of that. To be the cities that have grown very fast in the latter half of last century and this century were often very different places for several years. So Tauranga was a seaside village of sorts. Tauranga was planning provisions for CBD for decades had pretended it's still a seaside village. It isn't. And now we have government telling them, oh, we'll build tall ones because having a 2-story height was what it was they had in the city. Good. So it isn't a mathematical exercise. It is fundamentally based about quality and contribution. We do need some guidance on what that is, and things will differ regionally. So buildings that might just be the things you get in streets and on the road might be special in South Auckland or special in Rockhampton or special in Hamilton and vice versa. So there's a regional and then a local element to it. We've talked about that too. But overall, there needs to be a quality that you have to warrant being protected in terms of Section 7. The more precision you get into your criteria or how you do it, whichever plan you have, the precision you get in terms of what you're looking for, the easier it is for people to identify whether you're in or out, whether it's fair that you've been given. And the fairer the public generally think that is, the less likely you are, I suspect, to have your visions tipped over in the future because there's a backlash against that. Some backlash, federal backlashes, if you like, was tree protection in general tree protection in district plans, where somebody probably used to tell them what and complained about it, so we removed it. And Auckland City Council, the council that had the toughest provisions in terms of trying to get over the line on trees, went along to the select committee and said, we support it. And the answer was, you don't have to support change in legislation, just exercise Section 32 properly. But the consequence there was too much bureaucracy, too difficult to no bureaucracy and no protection at all. And I think that is the risk that we always face in terms of this heritage character balance. We've got to pitch it right if we want it to be there in the long term. And the whole point of heritage protection, character protection, is the long. There is one other mathematical issue that came up this morning, I think, which was the discussion we had with Ms. Casson about the built heritage items, and her observation that there's something like 1.5 times as many coming in as there are currently in shelter, and category A only being 2%. Now, with respect, I'm not sure I'm surprised by that, because I suspect when Hamilton first looked at heritage in the city, there's some easy things you pick, which are the obvious A's, and you start with them. So you would want most of your A category sites already to be listed before you start another round. And I'm unsurprised that there's 2% that come in on the second round, because most of what you're looking at now are in big things that aren't so obvious, that are more at the cusp, where you've got possibly more judgment being exercised on the margins to where it should come in. So I think in that context, it's not a random sample. It's not like you said, here's the part of Hamilton we looked at, we're going to look at the rest of them now. It's start with a really high quality and let's then think about what can. And the second part of the mathematics is maybe there's too many B's now in terms of this 5 times as many coming in. Certainly, Cadigan has identified some that come out. And from Aura's perspective, there are some that this is challenged that it should come. So it's always going to be, I think, more contentious as you get closer to the margin, where things, ironically, where things are have less historic heritage, is where you're going to have more debate. Because that's the point where the rules start to kick in, but maybe it shouldn't. And that's where we need to think really carefully about, again, not crying wolf, not getting too much in the list, and in a sense, devaluing everything on the list because we've done it. I think, sir, that's what I need to say arising from what Mr. Muldowney said yesterday. I'm not sure if there's anything in here that you would like to question me on, any submissions or the other part you'd like to take more detail on. Those I think are the critical issues.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, just on the, I think you were here when there was a discussion about where the consideration of other matters of national importance should sit, and how you balance those. And we heard from Mr. Eccles his view around Section 32, but also taking into account those matters at the time you're deciding whether or not to schedule something, as opposed to whether it's inappropriate. Be interested in your views on are the other matters of national importance things that affect whether or not something is categorised or falls within the definition of historic heritage, or does it only become relevant at the time where you're considering what is or isn't appropriate use of that?
I think there might be two parts to that. First is the wording of 6F compared to the other matters of national importance, how the courts have dealt with them. So, and again, Mr. Muldowney touched on this in his questions, but I think we're both at the point where there's more judgment, and you put the flexibility through itself as opposed to definition. But if we've got outstanding landscapes, or we have fauna and flora that then we need to. I was attempting to say, if you've got it, you've got to the threshold. Now the council needs to deal with it. I think the distinction in practice, if not in wording, Section 6 between that and the historic heritages, with respect to that definition, as we said earlier, almost anything counts. Everything could be in there. So to make that work, we need to apply a threshold to it. And that's the discussion we're having on the whatever. So I think there is a difference in practice in the way that we deal with those parts of the section, because there has to be. Some things, or to some extent, irreplaceable that we have lost in the 1960s. We could think about maybe we find a good street, beautiful street, protect that, and other things flow in it. We can cover things that are natural, floral, and landscapes. Take out absolute approach. The second part of the question, I think, is what if the situation where a building that arguably has, but is in the context where it has these other things as well. It might be landscape qualities, or next to a location, multiple properties, are those things that feed on each other that keep me over the line. It may well be, but it might be because of the relationship between that building and those other things. You might, for example, want to control the things that happen to the building because of the landscape. So it may be that that's the trigger for it. I suspect there's a circumstance where the council could say the combination of all these factors means that this does warrant protection. By doing that, the building. Aspects of the home. To do that, I think you do need to have some trigger. If you need to get above a bar, you might be more lenient in terms of the bar there because of context than you are on other cases. So whether we have in this case.
Yeah, let's follow up on that. I mean, wouldn't we be more focused on recognition of other values or objectives or outcomes? Wouldn't we be more focused on things that cut across the recognition of heritage? One of which obviously might be the SUD, for example. Yeah, we've got this other objective that we need to recognise, and so that's the filter at the end of the.
In practice, that is the issue. But in terms of that exercise, you have to be separately satisfied that this is a requirement that one. if you get to the bar for heritage, but you can obviously use character to address the NDRS. But it is the problem then becomes a debate about what's the site-specific analysis you do, and what's the site? Is the site a block? Is the site just the title? Is it an area? Which is it might be played out over the next while or not, depending on what happens with the areas.
On a sort of global scale, it's like don't recognise too much character. Don't recognise too much built heritage, because that might then cut across in the future the achievement of these
No, I
objectives.
think those are two separate analyses. First is, in terms of section 6, which I personally think probably outranks the NDRS. Yeah. Do you and the NDRS provisions recommend, do you have something that warrants protection in terms of section 6? And we're discussing, it can't be everything realistically, because it has to be something more refined than that. When the subdivision development inappropriate. So once we figure out what that bar is, and we then identify things about the bar, they are listed for the purposes of section 6 and keep it wrong. Then when you come to your NDRS analysis, you will look at that and say, well, is this a qualifying matter? And the answer ought to be pretty simple, yes. And then you adjust the NDRS and provisions accordingly. But they are two different exercises. But I think one of them gets you to above a bar, that in practice is going to mean that you have a rationale for not applying the NDRS and setting it.
We're going to put a threshold floor into the plan. How do we do that? Do we do that by means of a policy of indicating, for the purpose of this plan, council has X, Y, or do we put it through a rule, or do we just smuggle it into the methodology? Or
Well, I suppose you could do any of it. So I think a policy is quite useful in that it does gives guidance. It can give a direction of travel on a bunch of different factors or criteria, feeds into the rule, and in the end, the rule just has the list. You determine whether, you might have a mechanism that's set out in the plan, of course, to how it obviously is. But I think that the right place to start that exercise is the policy. It expresses what we're trying to, the objective expresses what we're trying to do, but the policy expresses how you're trying to get to the. That's where I think it's good guidance without becoming. We're stuck in the camp. Brown, so he has two statements, but I think you might start with the one on today's topic. The built heritage and very much speak to the other.
Thank you, Commissioner. To check we can all hear that. So, as thank you, I have two statements. One is my primary statement of evidence for the built heritage topic, and the other is a rebuttal statement on that historic heritage area. By and large, they cover. There's a crossover in terms of the cover. The key aspect that we've touched on in the submission statement there from Douglas, which is the need to define a method to set a threshold in order to reasonably establish risk of an appropriate subdivision development. For me, that's I think the key focus of these conversations, and listening to the previous submitters as well. It's been a focus of their interest. So we've probably sort of run to there, but in terms of my summary, what I've what I agree with in terms of the council's position is that I agree that a two-tier system of heritage classification should be adopted. I agree that a clearer threshold system should be established. I agree that there should be a disaggregation of the spatial component from the operative plan to make that clearer. And I support those built heritage provisions and adjustments to them proposed by Mr. Cadigan. So where there's a departure, and this is probably more in relation to the HHA, because while Mr. Cadigan has some discussion about the nature of the term moderate, she agrees that it doesn't meet the kind of threshold. It is, however, still employed in a threshold capacity by Mr. Knott for the HHA, so we'll touch on that probably afterwards. But there is a causally related aspect to that, I think, that's important to address, because in my view, if you're going to have one approach to defining heritage and evaluating the threshold, that should apply both to places and to areas. There's no distinction in 6F. 6F specifically says places and areas. So in my opinion, it should be a consistent method applied across both aspects. Diversion from that potentially is that heritage areas are often just defined as heritage areas being significant or more significant and not necessarily split into areas. And that's kind of typical across a number of plans where heritage areas have been introduced, including Auckland, Christchurch, Queenstown, Lakes District plans, so that's probably the key focus, I think. I have, as noted in the submission, I have looked at and reviewed a number of properties in relation to Claremont for a submission, but we haven't touched on them individually here because that's a matter for topic 3. So it's just to say that in terms of the general approach, and this seems to be quite interesting to me, it also came out in, I think, some of the recommendations from Ms. Cadigan and some of the comments in the section 42 report from Ms. Gold, in terms of not including items that are just sort of generically typical. So, and I think some of the issues that I picked up, and I think we also had that Adam Wild and the case, which is that some of the reasoning, I think they use the term facts, not values. So just a statement of fact, default becomes a value. I think that sometimes misses the story that makes the place valuable and interesting. And I think that's one of the aspects that, particularly for the HHAs, is really difficult to disaggregate the kind of character approach to the heritage values approach in terms of 6F. And it goes back to that qualitative aspect that Douglas is talking about, that need to define the degree of contribution of a place before you can appreciate whether a proposal is inappropriate or not. And to be fair, that's the key nub of it, because whenever you're doing a heritage impact assessment, any type of whether it's archaeology or so an archaeologist, so to speak to that, but whether it's that with built heritage in an area, what you're measuring is the risk that change is good or bad, and you're measuring that risk against a defined value versus a defined impact. And the matrix spits out the result. And in terms of a threshold, what we find in practice, and certainly in terms of how matrices are constructed for that exercise, if you've got something that's kind of moderate, you're rarely going to get to a point where the risk is so great you're going to impact significantly so that a development shouldn't occur. And that's why, in terms of my position, I think that's where the sort of bar for the threshold sits in terms of the plan, at the plan level, to direct the behaviour of the community towards those particular assets. And we heard from the man earlier, it's about that cost to the burden of cost. And I think if you set that bar at the appropriate level, that risk of burden of cost falls away substantially to the individual. And I think that's important when we're considering the constraints that you put on an individual by virtue of a community process. So I think that really probably covers my consideration of the threshold and of the method. And I understand that we're looking to talk about doing expert paneling next week to try and bring that out. So I think might just take you to any questions at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. I mean, you've heard most of our questions. I don't know if we've got any new questions. Any new questions?
Well, probably the same question from Mr. Brown.
Yeah.
I mean, you've reviewed and commented on Ms. Cadigan's, direction of travel on built heritage. You sort of fairly much on board with where that's going in terms of what needs to be done at a general level.
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty aligned with it, to be honest. It's very much looking across what the Auckland model is. There's a value in that we've heard about the lack of national direction. So there's a value in establishing a quantum approach, certainly with the relationship with the Auckland region, Waikato region, so closely interconnected. So I think this question of tinkering and refining some of the terminologies, we're not quite clear on the definite terms, for example. And I think the other thing falling out of that is things like I talked about the nature of the definition of setting, which I think is problematic. So, but in general terms, I'm broadly aligned with the recommendations that the problems taken.
Right. So in terms of the criteria that's on the district plan at the moment, which is like an expansion, if you like, of some of the WRPS, do you see that's what sort of changes do you see? I mean, do you see it as fining down and making it sort of crisper and more consistent in terms of those subcategories, or what's the nature of the changes that you?
Yeah, I think certainly I support the notion of, and we heard about the RPS forming the basis of the heritage evaluation categories, and I think that's correct because, again, that helps with the regional consistency. I think, obviously, there are slightly different wordings with the ODP, and there's also this idea of introducing the group value concept. But still, to my mind, is giving effect to the RPS, which then in turn is sort of leading to success. So I think there's consistency there. I think, again, it's a refinement of probably terms and agreement as to where the consensus of view falls on that. There was a talk about, do you put particular emphasis on one heritage category over another? Well, Section 6F doesn't do that. So if you're an archaeological value, you're equally as valuable as if you're an architectural value. And then there's a cultural value component. So I think in terms of the criteria, you do need to recognise that sometimes these aspects are quite distinct. Sometimes they're overlapping. So a 19th century building is technically an archaeological site under the Heritage Places Act. So it could have both archaeological values and architectural values inherent in its physical structure. In terms of things like the A's and B's, it's the strength of that value that's important in terms of identifying whether something's regionally or nationally significant. And it might be that there is one value that's regionally or nationally significant that's so particular to that place that it warrants that category. I think there's a conversation about that with the A's. Or it might be that it's a sort of cumulative outcome of several categories being valuable. But very often what we find in practice is with those higher places of interest, they will exhibit more than one, and usually 3 or 4 values at a very high level for that reason that they are overlapping. So in terms of the refinement there comes through a defined method and guidance document that becomes part of or is referred to through the district plan. It doesn't necessarily even embedded directly into district plan. The Auckland Council one isn't, and the reason for that is so that it allows some changes over time as practitioners change their practices or their theories and philosophies might move on, but still need some kind of reference point which everybody can go to and repeat the exercise. And then the second part of that that's important, and it was mentioned before, is the comparative component. And I think one of the issues that I'm finding is some of the proposed places is that the comparative component hasn't been done to demonstrate why a place is important in the Hamilton context. So an example might be a steakhouse. Why is a steakhouse important here as opposed to a steakhouse in Oamaru or somewhere else? They're the same building, same structure, same degree of authenticity, but that one's not scheduled. So, and this one, you know, why is it important? And I think in particular for places like that that are actually commonplace, that bar needs to be really clearly expressed, because otherwise you do run that risk of exporting kind of lock, stock and barrel everything into it. I think the point was well made by Douglas that it's at the margins where most of the arguments happen. And certainly my experience is I'm in a hearing always when it's a point of contention, not where I've never been in a hearing for, say, the Lake House bars in Rotorua. Everybody fully understands the value of that place, it's no issue. But I'm always in hearings around somebody's extension on a character house, you know, in the back. So it's
So on that,
yeah,
is it possible that that house was at the margin
yeah,
and fell on the wrong side of it?
yeah, exactly. And I think that's why selling them high, although there's a risk that you do lose places, ultimately they often come on through review. Everything that you do in terms of plan change is a point in time and look, it's a slice through a historic section of a place in time. And the whole point of them is they're not static, they're supposed to be reviewed periodically. And as you do that, as you go through that periodic review, as an expert, as a practitioner, more places will come on, places will fall away. It's organic, it's the nature of it. But I think you need to set that bar high that you can robustly defend anything that you put on that list in any given time.
Is the comparative component that you talk about, is that more relevant for the Bs and prospective Bs than it is for the As? Because the As are going to get through on all the other costs.
But the A's have kind of almost had it done by virtue of the fact that they're usually often places of such interest and so on. They've been studied, they've been written about. The information is readily available and it's there. So it's the places where, particularly where places of local interest, not regional or national interest, where, let's put it this way, you can go to Egypt and see the pyramids, and everybody knows that's an amazing place. You just go, look at that, what an effort. But for local places where that story is particularly distinct and fine-grained and granular, most people will just walk past and not get it. So it is really important, I think, at that level to be demonstrating clearly, robustly, and without prejudice why that place is important.
So you're saying we need to be more satisfied or more robust evidence base to support the types of items that might be on the margins there?
If you're going to put them in a schedule, yes. Because what you're doing is constraining somebody's right to do something on the basis of the common good, which is a heritage value, that you as an expert have attributed to it, maybe without consultation, maybe without particular research that might demonstrate that. If you're just saying, oh, I think something's important because it's a steakhouse, and it's a good example of a steakhouse, well, I could go to you and go, well, there's 50 steakhouses down the road, and they're all exactly the same, so why this one? Or why a villa, or why a bungalow? And I think Ms. Cadigan talked about yesterday, the one bungalow came off because the statement just said it had this window under the veranda, and that was not strong enough reason to include it in the schedule. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Whereas if the villa was a good example, but also happens to have somebody who lived there who contributed to the history of Hamilton, that's going to be more resonant with the story of Hamilton and its heritage values.
I want to leap into HHAs, but I mean, I guess the issue there and what we don't have here is that has development periods defined with what falls on. So in a sense, that already satisfies that for HHA, but we don't have comparable for those.
Some of the value statements, they vary in terms of quality depending on who's done them, when they were done, in the interest of the person looking at them will pick up different things. So I, with an archaeological background, will look at something different to say Adam Wild picking up an interest in from an architectural background, potentially. And so it's important to see those comparative components so that somebody else can come along and go, yeah, okay, I get it, I understand that.
So you're looking at replicability and you're looking at validity of standard tools.
Yeah. And it's a best practice kind of heritage approach to do that, because what we're doing is we're making a statement of value because something is valuable because, and it's not good enough, I think, to say because it was built in 1888. Okay, that's one thing, but so are a lot of other places why this place. But I think that's the one I was getting to in terms of tax on not necessarily values.
And you think that's missing currently from the criterion, or it's just submerged in some of the other stuff?
In terms of the reasoning for putting some of the places on the schedule, I haven't looked at all of them. To acknowledge that. I'm looking at ones in relation to order submission. But I think in terms of particularly the classes of places that are relatively common. When we look across plans generally in the country, you'll see a lot of villas, you'll see a lot of bungalows, you'll see quite a few state houses. There's people who kind of accept that that's part of the narrative. You'll see heaps of churches. It's very rare not to schedule a church with the way community values are associated with them. So I think those comparative components are important, as you might say, why this place is first and another place. And partly it then goes to inform Section 32 report, which Mr. Eccles talked about, is that it gives you the ability as a planner in a wider context to then make decisions over whether places are in or out.
I was there to point to that, which is my observation is that where you have these categories that are common, so state houses are common, whatever, villas, bungalows, they commonly end up, where they are protected or recognised, to come through the character mechanism in the plan. So in Auckland's case, it's largely the character. There are some historic heritage period that are few there, and the issue is, do you protect them all or do you protect part? And the issue, we'll come to this in short later, but the issue, as you've heard for Kamakura, is it's got assets that aren't simply houses bought by people who like to live in villas or like to live in bungalows. It's got a housing asset that it needs to house lots of people. So the important thing there, I think, from its perspective, is to try and identify the things that matter most, but enable development of the balance. And that's the real tension we've had in this series of hearings, because not only have the NDRS floated it, which is a separate issue, we have the need for the housing authority to use its resources as efficiently as it can and house people in houses that are warm and dry and suitable for the family types that we have now in 2023 as opposed to what we had in 1955. And that's where the real tensions arise. Part of our argument is a lot of the things that are in there kind of areas are probably being
are going to be character, not heritage. But there may be, and there may be a rationale for having exemplars, if you like, of these things to remind us of how this important part of housing in New Zealand developed. But at that point, we had this tension, we had too much of it.
I think of one good example of where you would have a heritage item that you wouldn't necessarily schedule, because that was is the Auckland Harbour Bridge. Everybody understands that it's got a high historical value from an engineering perspective and a cultural perspective in terms of connecting the two communities. But it's unlikely that you would schedule it in a plan, because that would potentially impact its day-to-day operation, maintenance, and other aspects. So that is, you know, an example of where, from a Section 32 point of view, wouldn't schedule something on the basis of
But that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, if somebody made an application for it and you were hearing, you tick all the boxes.
but the Auckland Harbour Bridge actually.
So what's the basis that we would then, because we've got a couple of those ones which tick the boxes, but that's no reason the argument is that it shouldn't proceed.
But I think you look at what's the risk that any kind of, because we've got to remember that an asset owner potentially would just look after that asset. You've got to also remember that if something's being used for a particular purpose and that purpose, designed purpose, like the Auckland Harbour Bridge, and it continues to be used for that purpose, it's unlikely to affect the values for which it would be scheduled. Also, that purpose is consistent how it was developed and constructed and conceived. There are cases where, in the instance with the police station, you've got a conflict of values potentially, because there's a cultural value that places value on the land, not destruction. And that's a weighing exercise in my mind. So I think you've got those factors to consider. If you're presented with an argument and a rationale from a planning perspective, this is sort of a bit outside my wheelhouse. I spend most of my time in the planning environment. Then that's on the decision of that's on the decision makers as to whether they can justify excluding something, notwithstanding that it's recognised for value. Remembering that 6F and the RMA still places an onus of behaviour on people, whether something's scheduled or not.
And I'd add to that 6F talks about protection of historic heritage from inappropriate subdivision use and development, and in the case of the bridge, and paying it, increasing its ability to do things is, you would say, is not necessarily inappropriate.
But you could schedule it and it would not be appropriate.
I guess you could schedule it and then have a special set of rules that says difficult then becomes your truck. Say when we went from 4 to 8 lanes, that changed the look of the bridge significantly. I always think to the better, but that's because I've always really paying money. So it's just that's what it looks like.
And the culverts are done.
Yeah, so I think again it brings us back to Section 6F is not an absolute protection of historic heritage. It's that from inappropriate subdivision development. And that comes into the equation at some point, whether it comes in at the scheduling point or at the rule that relates to what arises from scheduling.
Or some sort of generic exclusion policy.
Okay.
I have one more question on that. Planning provisions, that was Maddie commented on, Mr. Brown, on definitions of setting surroundings.
Yeah.
I'll just take you to 6.6. For one brief.
Yeah.
The proposed definition of setting, in my opinion, conflates the broader nature of a setting with that of the surround or extended place. Then you gave us a couple of examples, one out of the AUP.
Yeah.
And I did note that the AUP doesn't have a definition of surroundings, so it goes with setting. And I think it seems to be that setting covers what it needs to cover, doesn't need surroundings. You gave us two definitions there, both of which are quite different, but one was quite physically descriptive of what's in the setting, and the other one really talked about the relationship of setting to the item itself.
That's right.
The UK national land laws. But then you went on to then just propose an addition or change to the definition of surrounding. So I sort of left me with a question as to do you think was the most appropriate definition, because setting is enough, given that we're going to have greater use of extended place.
Yeah.
I understand as well.
My view of it, in terms of is, I think one of the issues with the spatial planning approach is that you'll have an overlay and that will be applied to a site, and that is defining where you then apply the rules. So then one of the problems with surrounds and setting, and again, this is what I'm always an environment call for, it's not something that's happening within an overlay, it's the margins. One of the problems is that you are then relying they all have a contextual relation. Way of dealing with it. Another situation might be where you have relic kind of landscape or wider gardens that were associated with a big house and have been subdivided off. That's quite common. I think we talked about that yesterday. There was some discussion about that in some landscape aspects and things. So for me, the setting definition is important because it's defining what matters to the place. And then that is also potentially experiential. So if you've ever been past a historic brewery, there's a particular smell from the hops that can pervade the town, like in the case of Kent, where you go to a hot town and you know you're there from the smell. So it's so it's not necessarily visual, it's experiential, and that's where that UK definition is trying to draw some of that out.
Well, the UK definition steps straight up, setting straight into surround.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a distinction.
No.
So are we making a distinction, or?
I think from the point of view of a spatial planning process, in order to strongly apply the rules for heritage, it's helpful to be distinct in terms of the setting and say this is where those rules apply, and this is where you apply them. If you wanted to capture adjacent places, then you need a policy or a rule that talks about capturing adjacent places. There's an example of that in the city component of the Auckland plan, where if you're doing development next to a character or heritage building, there are some criteria for evaluation that you would look at the new development, for example, and seeing how it responds to its neighbour. But it's not common generally in most of the plans I've worked with. So,
But how can, yeah, I mean, just on that example, is that defined by being adjacent? Because I mean, if you're relying just on the fact that something was within the setting, that gets pretty arbitrary, doesn't it? To say, well, you're 3 doors down the road and you have this A-listed building, and you're within the setting.
argue the other way, I suppose.
Yeah, I think from the plan perspective, where the definition is intended to take place is where you then apply spatial extent, then that's the setting. Obviously, there's going to be a period of overlap in this plan in particular where those spatial extents aren't applied in an overlay. We had that with the Auckland context where there was a default kind of extent in place for the sites that hadn't had their spatial extents defined. So it is a difficult one because there are different points of view. But my point of view is that the definition of setting is something that relates closely to the values of the place. And you incorporate that in your evaluation of the place and your understanding of its heritage values. So it's clearly articulated. That means even when there's a policy rule that might be a bit ambiguous, if you then go to your statement of significance, you should find the hook to be able to make that interpretation on the policy will apply to you. I think that's a technical process that's important.
James Brown, very helpful. Anything else? No? Tony?
Good. I'm just not sure, is that the end of?
That is the end of it, yes. We have one no show.
Right. Do I have the starting point in terms of juice and very heavy handed up and comments I'd like to make about it in terms of what doesn't address, which I think it's
just a question as to whether there's anything happened this morning that would just modification leading to the modifier.
I don't think so, only because of how far it goes and what it doesn't do. And really the matters that I want to press you on in terms of where ballot are very much linked to the discussion this morning. Right. So I think the easiest thing to do is hand it around and just get it. Right. Numbers of copies we might
I don't need. Yeah.
I might just stay confused. Speak side on. So there's a couple of observations I want to make about the document first, and then just talk about some of the things that I think conferencing can usefully deal with. So what Ms. Cadigan has done here is take the ODP provisions and refine them and edit them slightly. So the first thing that you'll see has happened is there's been some refinement and editing of the ranking of significant plan ranking A and plan ranking B categories. And you can see that the only distinction that's made between plan ranking A and plan ranking B is that plan ranking A is described as highly significant heritage and plan ranking B is described as significant heritage. The other important, I think, factor here in terms of what Ms. Cadigan has done is she's recognised that for plan ranking A, you can be dealing with local, regional, or national in terms of the geographic context. And equally with plan ranking B, you can also be dealing with local, regional, or national. So the experts have talked about this disaggregation of the geography from the evaluation of the quality, and I think this is where it's happening. So the point there, and the observation I make, is that there seems to be a recognition, certainly from Ms. Cadigan, that there's no merit, for example, in saying that only regionally or nationally ranked items get to A. You can be local and you can still be A, and equally you can be national and you can be B. So that's the first observation I'd make about that. So again, that's probably the first piece of work that's been done in the ODP provisions. And then you move into the heritage assessment criteria itself, and again, starting with the proposition that each of these qualities that are identified here are largely reflective of APP7, but they are a refinement. And whereas APP7 for each of these qualities tended to break them into subcategories of 2, 3, and 4, Ms. Callaghan has just simply distilled them down, distilled the essence of APP7 down into a single statement or paragraph. So that's a difference. I noted Mr. Brown's evidence. I think there's no real contest on this point that the ODP provisions are a general reflection of APP. It's actually replicated. It does the job in terms of giving effect to APP7. So there's been some editorial work done to each of the qualities. And you can see there that for the physical, aesthetic and architectural qualities and for the cultural qualities, there's a couple of alternatives that have been put. And that's just a sort of a drafting preference. The paragraphs, I think, tended to be sort of the single paragraph had a lot to it, and breaking it down might make it easier for the reader. So that was the only reason for those two alternatives. The other comment I would make is just in terms of the context quality C, which is that additional quality. I still maintain my position in the submissions yesterday that I think we need to be careful about that quality. I don't think can exist on its own without having an element of the qualities that are referred to Section 2 definition of heritage. If the context quality doesn't possess some other of those listed qualities, I think there would be a problem legally with that if you were going to hang your head on that alone. And it may be that there's a little bit more on that one. Take care of. Those are the qualities that, and that's as far as the document goes. And as I say, the thing I really wanted to address you on was what it doesn't yet do. And this is really, I think, where the experts need to be thinking about in terms of what additional elements they add to this document. And one of the first issues that I think is important for the experts and also for you as a panel is to decide, do you want to see additional certainty in terms of the methodology around rankings and thresholds and so on? Do you want to see it embedded in this assessment criteria in the district plan? Or, as some territorial authorities seem to do, prefer to sit it side by side as a guidance note. Right, legal issues associated with having guidance documents that sit beside district plans. Guidance documents don't go through a first scheduled process. They don't have the rigor that is attached to the documents that go through this process. They can be changed by council from time to time. There's also the legal issues around incorporation by reference, all sorts of issues that I think are relevant to whether we leave some of these additional items out as a guidance note or we bring them and embed them in the plan. And on that point, I would say that there is, I think what we've been attempting to do here is bring certainty to an area that has a lot of inherent uncertainty. I think there is force in the argument, and Mr. Allen, I think, mentioned it, that public confidence in the district plan and plan making will flow from as much certainty as you can drive into the document. Bearing in mind, I think what we've heard this morning is that there is, you can chase a false precision here. And I think that's been part of the problem, is that, you know, attempting to create some kind of pure tick box exercise for historic heritage doesn't sit easily with the nature of.
Just remind me, does the SNA methodology, is the SNA methodology in the plan, or is that because I mean, they're similar, these, you've got a principle problem.
I'll have to refresh the memory.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll put it down, I haven't picked it up.
Yes,
Yeah, I'll come back on it. So, so firstly, the issue that I want to just highlight was that question of, do you drive some more certainty into this document through additional provisions, or do you leave it as a guidance note, which is an issue, and it needs to be explored both by the experts and also then the question is what additional matters need to be addressed in that guidance note, or what you would drive into this document. And there are a few things that I want to deal with that arose in part from this morning's discussion, which was very helpful, but have been floating around more generally. The first is in answering and addressing an evaluation of a particular quality, is it helpful to have some kind of scale from nil to low to moderate to significant to outstanding, or something similar of that nature? Is it useful to experts when they come to answer the question that's posed in one of these criteria? Is it helpful to order their thoughts in terms of that kind of continuum or scale? We have been proceeding, I think all of us, on the basis that there is some value in that kind of order and that kind of approach. And I think that if there is value in it, it would be helpful just to settle on a scale that in terms that we all can work with, instead of chopping and changing in terms of I think that's the first thing. Is it useful to have a scale of descriptors? If so, what should that be? Let's stick with it. Then the next question, which is the one that's been exercising all of our minds, is should there be a threshold at which point something magically becomes historic heritage and warrants? Okay. Now, just parking that critical question for a second, there's a few other factors that I think came from this morning's conversation that I think the experts should be talking about. First is there something in this idea that there is an accumulation of qualities that can influence where an item or a place finally sits in terms of the evaluation? And I'm talking about the Wild's idea of a matrix, where if you get two moderates, you somehow become high or outstanding if you were to get four moderates. Is there something useful in that concept of a kind of an accumulation of scores or qualities? And I suppose on the flip side of that coin, is there a danger in one quality being identified as moderate and somehow being scheduled? Is there a point where moderate just isn't enough, somehow magically becomes enough if it's combined with other moderates? I don't have an answer, but I think it's a critical part of the conversation the experts need to have, and which may feed into the guideline. The other factor that I'm hearing, which I think is relevant, and again, I'm not entirely certain if there's consensus on this, is what role the local, regional, and national importance or relevance starts to have in the overall evaluation, and how that is factored into the evaluation. I think there needs to be a better articulation of what the experts are talking about in terms of this geographic consideration. And then another factor that I think is useful in terms of this guideline or guidance is what role does this comparative component play in identifying historic heritage? And it seems to me that the comparative element is something that very much sits at the end of the evaluation, where you're doing some sort of, and this probably leads to my next point, which is this, that the emerging evidence today seems to be, as I said, this idea of a simple tick box exercise which produces a result and determines whether something is heritage or not, seems to be an exercise of chasing some false precision, where the experts are saying that'll take you so far, but there has to be an overall evaluation, some kind of stepping back and evaluating the item. Now, on that point, I am not talking about Mr. Eccles' section 32 evaluation. That's a different, later planning question. I'm still in evaluating the historic heritage item. I'm saying that the message that I'm hearing from some of the experts is that the assessment of the criteria and the scaling and all the rest of it will take you so far, but you need to then have some opportunity to see.
It's a truth sense.
Yeah. And so how does that work in the guidance document? And is it at that place that the comparative analysis, where you start to think about, well, how does it measure up against some of the other examples? That's whether that's a historic, whether that has its place in the assessment of whether it's historic heritage or not, or whether the comparative analysis actually has its place in the 32 assessment and the later assessment. So yes, it's historic heritage, but for comparative analysis reasons, we're not going to list it. We're going to just leave it to the operation of section 6F to take care of it in a different way. And I think there's a question as to where comparative analysis does.
Where and who does it?
Because it may be that, I mean, the comparative analysis, I think, still needs heritage expertise, but then determining whether or not listing occurs, I agree with. So I think the comparative, when I was thinking about comparative analysis, I was thinking, well, it feels like the experts are saying that it's part of the determining whether something is historic heritage. But I wonder whether it's more comfortably sitting in the stepping planning evaluation. Listen, not.
I mean, that raises a question which I was going to raise anyway, which is, in terms of the expert confidence, is there any value in actually having some of the planners sit and look and go around those particular and only part from
I think there's certainly there's certain discussions that I think need to happen between the heritage experts. Purely, there's certainly an overlap. I mean, the purpose of me sort of working my way through this checklist is really, if you are to take what Ms. Cadigan has produced and say, well, that's good, in terms of the articulation of the qualities and reflecting APP7, very happy, does the job, comfortable with the Plan A and Plan B ranking. Now, how do we drive a little bit more certainty into the district plan here in terms of an evaluation methodology? Those questions that I've just, and those issues that I've just raised, they feel like the sorts of areas that I'd like the experts to be concentrated on, because that's where I think the guidance can come. And then there's that, as I say, that fundamental question of where should this sit? Do we have it as a guidance document? Or do we get to embed some of the heritage assessment front? And if I had to signal a preference, it would be I'd go for district plan certainty. I get nervous about external guidance documents. No, the environment report does and is critical of times in terms of their status. So, but we'll typically say you've got something to say it in the district plan and say it's simply it's awesome. So my preference if I had one would be to see if we could lift up these issues that are misidentified, bed them in the assessment criteria. And it may be that they're embedded as relevant factors, but at least articulate them, write them down and have them there for plan users to read, but don't necessarily prescribe the paint by numbers kind of certainty. Which would be nice, but I think we're all starting to understand a certain amount of precision that you can drive into this, and then there are judgments. So the question is, can we pick up some of those points and describe them as relevant factors or considerations to help with the evaluation of the quality? That to me would be where
Right, well, I guess the question is, and yes, we'll clearly issue direction on that with some direction. Who will orchestrate this is my question in my head. Is it going to be sufficient? It's a completely rhetorical question. It's going to be sufficient to let the heritage people to their own devices. I think it needs some direction.
I think it may need some facilitation. I think the first point in facilitation is a clear direction from the panel in terms of the task and what you want to produce with this discussion. I think that's number one. Then it may be that if we need to facilitate a dollar is task that maybe it should go.
Yeah, I imagine you're going to take place virtually anyway. I'm not assuming,
yes.
I'm not assuming everybody will come into the same spot. So, sorry, yeah.
They are coming to.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll give some thought to facilitate. I do probably feel that a clear set of articulated tasks will certainly help, and then you can get someone to keep everyone on.
Yeah, I think that's all it is. It's a babysitter.
Yeah, that's right. So it may not need quite the level of moderation that the previous conferencing has required.
Yeah, we'll have a conversation about this, obviously, and get something out. Hopefully by the end of the day, everyone will notice that it's going to happen, so that's fine. Thank you for your assistance there, and everybody.
It'd be very helpful. Just one just procedural point is that it may, I think, be useful in terms of this areas. I don't want to throw a wild card in.
No, I was about to retract my babysitter and put in someone more fierce.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good idea because we do want to.
And I know that he has views on moderate as well, and that's fine. But I think at some point we have to try and crash the two together.
Yes.
I think now's the time.
Yes. Yes, I have no idea whether the panel is sitting in Auckland at the moment. That's next week.
Well, I know he's down next week. Is there some suggestion that that's why happening next week?
Thursday. Yes.
All right. Well, I'll
check and just give me a line on it. If you have, we'll include it. Was that the morning or afternoon? Steve?
Okay, all right, we'll leave it.
Are there any other experts in the 888 area that are also in the?
Well, there's Dr. McEwen,
If we're going to socialise, we probably should socialise at least that far from the.
yes.
Definitely.
I'm just nervous about, extending it out and, you know, this discussion has started to become quite focused. And for those that haven't participated in this part of the hearing, I would worry that, and that's, I mean, that's why it's reservation goes not, but I think for council, it's important. I think, I guess on balance, if it's to be extended out, it should be extended to all. Again, with careful direction and focused tasks.
I mean, we want the focus to be on the methodology for built heritage.
Yes, we do.
And all right. Yeah, so think about that.
Well, yeah, I'm on the hands on.
All right. In that case, I think we're adjourned until tomorrow morning. We're at 9, are we speak tomorrow? Thank you. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.